From the most trusted names in local news, KDPG Sunday Edition.
Good morning and welcome to the KDPG Sunday Edition. I'm John Delano. Stacey Smith and Ken Rice are away this week. In almost every presidential administration, there have been battles between the executive branch and the press over freedom of information. But the latest confrontation came this month between CNN White House correspondent Jim Acosta and the Trump White House. It resulted in the White House taking away Acosta's regular White House press pass. CNN went to court, and as CBS's Mola Lenghi reports, the court ordered Acosta's pass to be reinstated.
CNN reporter Jim Acosta needed a court order to get back into the White House, and he got it.
This is just any other day here at the White House for me. I would like to get back to work.
CNN's lawsuit alleges that Acosta's First and Fifth Amendment rights were violated when the White House took away his credentials.
That's enough.
I was going to ask one of the other folks.
That's enough.
Pardon me, ma'am.
The White House claims it made the decision after Acosta refused to surrender a microphone during a press conference.
In response, the White House says it's creating rules for future press conferences, saying there needs to be some decorum.
We want total freedom of the press. It's very important to me. It's more important to me than anybody would believe. But you have to act with respect. You're in the White House.
President Trump hinted that the White House could try to revoke Acosta's pass again in the future.
They don't listen to the rules and regulations. We'll end up back in court and we'll win.
Many news organizations, including CBS News, filed friend of the court briefs in support of CNN's lawsuit to defend its constitutional rights. Mola Lenghi, CBS News, the White House.
Now, Judge Timothy Kelly didn't rule on the underlying case, but said CNN was likely to prevail on its Fifth Amendment claim. Judge Kelly said that Acosta did not receive an explanation as to why his credentials were revoked, nor, added the judge, was Acosta given the opportunity to rebut the White House's decision. That confrontation and renewed threats to take away Acosta's pass have ignited a discussion that has gone on since the First Amendment was written to the U.S. Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Now, is the First Amendment under attack, and what role should the press play, including expressions on the internet and other forms of social media in the 21st century? That's our topic this morning on the KDPG Sunday Edition. And we welcome our guests. Maggie Patterson is professor of journalism at Duquesne University's Mackinac College and Graduate School of Liberal Arts in the Media Department. Professor Patterson is a longtime reporter and the author of 3 books. Joseph Sabina Mystic is an associate professor of law at the Duquesne University School of Law. He has extensive experience in government, including serving as the chief of staff for Pittsburgh Mayor Sophie Masloff from 1989 to 1992. David Schrittman is away this week, so we welcome back Sally Stapleton, managing editor of the Post-Gazette. Hey, thank you all for being here. This is obviously a topic in which I admit tremendous self-interest, as I'm sure Sally does as well. Yes. So, you know, everybody take that with a grain of salt, but I think we feel these things very strongly as journalists and as people who operate, in my case, with the White House very frequently, having interviewed presidents and having been to the White House and to the White House briefing room a number of times over the decades. So, with that, let me just start with you, Professor Patterson. There's no doubt that presidents throughout our history have had difficulty with the media reporting. Is that not right?
Oh, of course it's right, and I think that's part of the job.
Part of the job?
Part of the job of the president and part of the job of the press, to create that heat. Yeah.
To create that heat. Is it qualitatively different with this president than with prior presidents?
Yes.
How so?
Yes. Well, I think that we elected a president whose experience is in business, not in government. And the American people who voted for him apparently felt that that was an advantage. But he is often reacting as if he were the head of a corporation rather than the president of a country. And I think that's the way he reacted with the Jim Acosta.
Are you suggesting then that presidents or elected officials have a special responsibility to work with the media, unlike a CEO of a corporation?
Well, yes, because tweeting out messages, he has complete control of that. But if you're going in front of the press, then they're going to ask you questions that are on the public's mind and that the president needs to be answering.
Professor Mystic, you come from the government side of things.
Yes, I do.
And Joe, I know that when you're working for an elected official, I was chief of staff to a congressman
you know well, that's
for
right.
14 years, and so I've been on the other side of this.
Sure.
There's no doubt that there's a lot you would rather not say to the press.
Well, that's for sure, but that's that tension that seems to inure to our benefit over the last couple of centuries in any event. We have politicians who would like to say less, and we have the media who would like to get them to say more. And somewhere, hopefully, we find each other in the middle and the truth comes out. The First Amendment is one of the amendments that we have a love-hate relationship with. Right. Professor Alan Dershowitz says it's freedom of speech for me, but not for thee. And there's some truth to that. Both ends of the political spectrum seem to use it as a weapon more than as a principle. It's most of us in the middle somewhere that seem to look at it as a principle.
And so do you see President Trump as different from other elected officials in the past?
Yeah, I do. I mean, he's much more aggressive, obviously, than most public officials are with the media. That generally takes you down a dark hole. You sort of spiral downward when you're that way. And I don't know if that's happening or not, but the midterm election might be a sign that some of this isn't working, and that might be related to his public posture towards the media.
Right. Sally?
If one looks at the rules that came out post Mr. Acosta receiving his credential back, they seem to me to be very generic. There are 4 facets to them. Can you talk a little bit, Professor Patterson, about how you see this playing out in coming days?
Well, I think that there is a level of trust that's missing and a level of respect for the role of the press that makes any ambiguity in rules very suspect. And how they will be used, we'll find out. But I think you're right to wonder whether or not the generic, I think this is beneath your question, the generic nature of these rules may become a threat.
I'm sorry.
Maybe we should we review those rules just
Certainly.
to be clear that everybody watching is on the
Certainly.
same page. I mean, I can read them here,
Go
or
ahead.
you can if you'd
Go
like.
ahead.
Basically, the first rule is a journalist called upon to ask a question will ask a single question, and then will yield the floor to other journalists. Now, I'm a master at the follow-up. I do follow-ups all the time. I mean, that in and of itself offends me as a rule. Yes?
It's an invitation to wiggle out of the question. So you give a bland answer that doesn't really answer the question, and the next reporter is on. Now, what the press corps could do is make some agreement among themselves to follow up and not allow that to happen. But that's tough because they're competitors.
Yeah, in a tough competitive business.
Yes.
Sophie always took follow-up questions.
Sophie would talk forever. She had nothing to hide.
The other rules on here are basically at the discretion of the president. A follow-up question may be permitted. So that goes back to it's up to the elected official to allow rather than for the reporter to follow up.
But truly, nothing in that is different than the way things have worked previously. So that is just stating what's always been the case before.
So does that mean we're comfortable with these rules?
Well, in order for the rules to be effective, they need to be objective and specific. There needs to be no room for interpretation. Government is entitled to lay down rules that will allow them to continue to operate in a reasonable manner. When there's ambiguity, as we find in these rules, that just invites more lawsuits. We'll be in court time after time after time unless these become more specific.
I have to say, as somebody, again, who has been to the White House and covered presidents and members of the cabinet and the vice president, all these other people, the White House is a unique location. Because of the security concerns at the White House, you have to go through a big security check in advance to get in there. Jim Acosta had what we call a hard pass. It's a pass that basically allows him to go in and out and without having, he does go through the metal detectors. Everything he brings in has to be checked every single time he comes in and out. But he doesn't have to have the background check that will be done when I'm invited down for a day, for example, because it's already been done long term. The problem is that if you revoke the hard pass without a security reason for doing it, you basically are pulling the Secret Service folks in and making them an arm of the White House for purposes of journalism or of protecting the president from questions he doesn't
Public
want.
safety is always a legitimate exception to any of these rules. The problem here is that this is a public forum. This is a public building. It's been used as a forum for the media, and once you do that, it's really hard to wriggle out of it, no matter who you are.
Do you think there are limits on what reporters should ask?
Not many that I could think of. I mean, maybe the bounds of decency, but I think that it has to be a free flow of information. I mean, that goes back to the most basic part of the principle behind the First Amendment, which is that we have to allow all the ideas out on the playing field to get to the truth.
So my sense is this is not a big issue. There will be future kerfuffles, but this is not the end-all be-all in the First Amendment. What seems more important to me is the president's response following the U.S. resident's murder in a Saudi Arabian embassy in Turkey.
Yeah.
I'm wondering your thoughts on that and the president's response on just earlier this week after the CIA had pronounced that they were definitively saying that the leader of Saudi Arabia was backing.
Well, there's a lot behind that. I mean, first of all, there's the disrespect for the other parts of government and the findings of the CIA expressing a lack of faith in what they're saying that's frightening, but also to say that there's virtually no value to the loss of life of this journalist who was just doing his job, and that there would be no investigation or concern about what happened to him.
Joe, do you want to add to that? And then we're going to have to take a quick break.
Well, yeah, it's a different guy, isn't he? You know, he does things and says things that none of us have ever heard before or even imagined from our president. The Khashoggi case is just the most recent, but perhaps the worst example of the kinds of reactions we're getting from our government.
We're going to break right here, and then when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about the Khashoggi case, because I think it's very important. I think we should also ask a little bit of how social media may be impacting the way journalists act at the White House. And then finally, are we giving the President of the United States too much attention? Is this part of why we see all that we see and why we have the confrontation? We're going to be back in just a few moments. Stick with us.